what convinced President Biden this was the right time to do cluster munitions, given the concerns? Did allies express concerns to him? And are you suggesting that the reason you're providing cluster munitions is because Ukraine is running out of unitary artillery rounds? Is it to backfill that?
So first, we have been looking at this for quite some time. And what we have been weighing is this basic question of civilian harm. The challenge of cluster munitions, as you know, is that even at low dud rates, there are some unexploded ordnance that is left, and that could potentially pose a risk to civilians down the road. So we did not immediately come out of the gate and provide this. But we had to balance that against the risk to civilian harm if Ukraine did not have sufficient artillery ammunition. We are reaching a point in this conflict because of the dramatically high expenditure rates of artillery by Ukraine and by Russia, where we need to build a bridge from where we are today to when we have enough monthly production of unitary rounds, that unitary rounds alone will suffice to give Ukraine what it needs. So as a result, this is the moment to begin the construction of that bridge so that there isn't any period over this summer or heading into this fall when Ukraine is short on artillery, and being short on artillery, it is vulnerable to Russian counterattacks that could subjugate more Ukrainian civilians. That is the thinking behind our decision. We consulted closely with allies in deciding to do this, and some allies who are not signatories to the Oslo Convention embraced it with open arms, said this is absolutely the right thing to do. Even allies who were signatories to the Oslo Convention, while they cannot formally support something that they've signed up to a convention against, have indicated both privately and many of them publicly over the course of today that they understand our decision, and fundamentally that they recognize the difference between Russia using its cluster munitions to attack Ukraine and Ukraine using cluster munitions to defend itself, its citizens, and its sovereign territory. So we feel that this will in no way disrupt the very strong, firm unity that we have heading into the NATO summit in Vilnius next week. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Jake. To follow up on the cluster munitions, last year in March, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she described those munitions as, quote, exceptionally lethal weaponry which has no place on the battlefield. So how do you square those comments with this decision? And secondly, has Ukraine provided you with any assurances or guarantees in terms of their use in civilian areas, that they won't use them within a certain radius of civilian areas, for example?
So Ukraine has provided written assurances that it is going to use these in a very careful way that is aimed at minimizing any risk to civilians. And by the way, Ukraine, the democratically elected government of Ukraine, has every incentive to minimize risk to civilians because it's their citizens, it's Ukrainians who they are trying to protect and defend. This is not Ukraine taking these and going and using them in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or in some faraway land. They're using them on their territory to defend their territory. So we believe that they're highly motivated to do this, and beyond being highly motivated, they have, to directly answer your question, provided these assurances to us. In terms of the ambassador's comments and other comments that have been bandied about, let me just say that the use of cluster munitions by Russia in this conflict is completely unacceptable on multiple counts. First, they are using them to attack a sovereign country in flagrant violation of international law. Second, they are using them specifically to strike after civilian targets, not only military targets, also in flagrant violation of international law. And with this weapon system, as well as other weapon systems, we have identified war crimes committed by the Russians. Third, and critically, there is a big difference between the type of cluster munition being used by Russia and the type that we would provide to Ukraine. As I mentioned before, ours have a maximum 2.5% dud rate. The dud rate of the Russian munitions is between 30 and 40%. And just so I don't get this wrong, I will read it to you. The Department of Defense assesses that during the first year of the conflict alone, Russian-fired cluster munitions deployed from a range of weapon systems have likely expended tens of millions of submunitions or bomblets in Ukraine. And then the final point, I think this is an important point. When I talk about what Russia's doing with cluster munitions, I'm not making an argument which says, they do it, so we'll do it. The argument I'm making is that Russia has already spread tens of millions of these bomblets across Ukrainian territory. So we have to ask ourselves, is Ukraine's use of cluster munitions on that same land actually that much of an addition of civilian harm, given that that area is going to have to be demined regardless. So that is why when we look at the situation today, as opposed to a year ago, and when we look at what Ukraine would be doing with these weapons as opposed to what Russia is doing with these weapons, we see a substantial difference. It doesn't make it an easy decision, and I'm not going to stand up here and say it is easy. It's a difficult decision. It's a decision we deferred. It's a decision that required a real hard look at the potential harm to civilians. And when we put all of that together, there was a unanimous recommendation from the national security team, and President Biden ultimately decided in consultation with allies and partners and in consultation with members of Congress to move forward on this step.
And Jake, are you satisfied with the pace and progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive thus far?
We get this question a lot. I'm not grading or judging the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I'm standing here in Washington, D.C. I'm not on the battlefield. My life's not on the line. So for me to sit here and say, I'm satisfied, I'm not satisfied, what I would say is that it is hard going. The Russians are dug in. They have thrown a lot of defense in manpower and munitions at this, and the Ukrainians have bravely, systematically been punching and pushing forward and will continue to do so. The Ukrainians also have a substantial amount of capacity. They have not yet committed to this fight. So the story of this counteroffensive is far from written, and we will continue to support Ukraine along the way.
Jake,
yes.
you said that Ukraine provided written assurances for how they would use these munitions. When was that provided? And also, can you just provide more details on what are those assurances?
So they provided them in the context of their written request to us for these munitions. So they reached out and requested them. I couldn't give you the exact date, but some weeks ago. And in doing so, the assurance that they provided was that they intend to use these munitions in a way to minimize the exposure of civilians, so outside of civilian areas and outside of areas that civilians traffic. That is to say, on the battlefield where they are presently both trying to defend their territory and to move forward.
Are there specific locations, though, red lines in those assurances, or did the administration advise them, only use these munitions in these specific locations?
This is going to be an ongoing conversation because obviously the battlefield is shifting at all times. So it's impossible to set down a map and define this with the level of specificity that maybe your question implies. But it does mean that this conversation needs to be ongoing, just as it is with every other weapon system that we're providing Ukraine. And so far, we have found that when Ukraine provides assurances to the United States about the use of its munitions, it has followed through on that in terms of the limitations and constraints it's placed on those. And we expect the same in this case. And I just want to underscore again, I know I sound like a broken record, but the idea that Ukrainian men and women fighting for the armed forces of Ukraine want to willy-nilly use these things in a way that are going to harm Ukrainian citizens, which is somewhat implied in the questions, I find, at odds with their fundamental desire to protect their countrymen and their willingness to put their lives on the line to protect their countrymen. So that's
Prigozhin's location?
I do not. Yeah.
Can you tell us specifically when the president signed the authorization? And also, we have seen over the course of this war how there were some no-go topics, F-16s, cluster munitions. Both of those are moving forward. Is there a line where the U.S. won't cross? Obviously, the president has said no U.S. personnel inside Ukraine. Is there some other limit, or does this suggest to President Zelensky that whatever he needs, ultimately he will get?
The president has been very clear from the very beginning of this conflict about two things that have been unwavering. First, the United States is not going to war with Russia in Ukraine. And second, the United States is not providing weapons to Ukraine to attack Russia. We do not encourage or enable attacks on Russian territory from Ukraine. The question of weapon systems has evolved as the conflict has evolved, but those two fundamental precepts have been true from the start. They remain true today, and they will be true tomorrow as well.
When did he sign it, sir?
I can't give you the exact specifics on that, but because I'll let the internal processes kind of have their sanctity. But he approved it, as I said, after a unanimous recommendation from his national security team.